Montana Territory, 1872. The harsh winter winds whipped across the endless prairie, carrying with them the promise of another brutal season. Frost clung to the weathered planks of the Reed homestead, a modest structure that stood defiant against the elements, much like its 19-year-old occupant, Fiona Reed. She stood at the door of her family's cabin, honey blonde hair tucked beneath a practical wool bonnet, her blue calico dress covered by a faded apron. Her clear green eyes surveyed the bleak landscape with a mixture of determination and resignation. 2 years since the fever had taken her parents, leaving her alone to manage their small claim. 2 years of proving to neighbors and land agents alike that a young woman could hold her own on the frontier. Fiona knew what people whispered when they thought she could not hear: that a slip of a girl with no husband had no business trying to work a homestead, that her stubbornness would get her killed before spring, that no man would want a woman whose hands were as calloused as a field hand's and whose face bore the marks of too much sun and worry. "No use for romance out here anyway," she muttered, returning to the hearth where a modest stew bubbled. "The land doesn't care if you're pretty, only if you're strong." This was the truth Fiona had come to accept. The frontier demanded sacrifice. Beauty, companionship, love, these were luxuries that survival did not permit. Her worth lay in what her hands could produce, nothing more. She had convinced herself that loneliness was the price of independence, and she would pay it gladly rather than surrender her parents' dream. As the winter sun began its early descent, Fiona peered through frost-laced windows at movement on the horizon. A rider, pushing hard through the gathering dusk, his horse leaving trails in the fresh snow. Not the usual monthly supply wagon, which wasn't due for another week. This was something else entirely. The figure grew larger, more substantial. A man hunched against the cold, urging his exhausted horse forward. Something about the urgency of his approach sent a chill through Fiona that had nothing to do with the weather. She grabbed her father's shotgun from above the door, loaded, always, and stepped onto the porch, squinting against the setting sun. The rider was nearly at her gate now, and she could see his horse was limping badly, steam billowing from its nostrils. "That's far enough," she called out, raising the shotgun to her shoulder. The rider pulled up short, raising one gloved hand. "Ma'am, I mean no harm." His voice was deep but strained. "My horse is injured. I've been riding 2 days straight from Helena." Fiona kept the gun steady. "State your business." "Xavier Vance. I've purchased the Rockingham. I'm looking for shelter until morning." The Rockingham, Old Man Miller's spread that bordered her homestead to the north. 3,000 acres to her meager 160. She'd heard rumors that some cattle baron from back east had bought it sight unseen. "The Rockingham is another 5 miles north," she replied coolly. "And my horse won't make another mile in this condition," he answered, dismounting carefully. In the fading light, she could see he was tall, extraordinarily so, towering well over 6 feet. Despite his size, there was a certain grace to his movements. "I can pay for feed and board." As he stepped into the light spilling from her doorway, Fiona felt her breath catch. This was no grizzled cowhand. Xavier Vance couldn't have been more than 25, with features that seemed more suited to an eastern drawing room than the harsh Montana wilderness. His jaw was strong but cleanly shaved, his eyes an intense blue beneath dark brows. His greatcoat could not disguise the breadth of his shoulders or the lean strength of his frame. "I don't need your money," she said reflexively, though in truth, she did. "But I won't turn away a man or beast in this weather." She lowered the shotgun slightly. "Stables around back. Tend to your horse first, then come in for supper." Something like surprise flickered across his handsome face. Clearly, he wasn't accustomed to being ordered about by a slip of a woman holding a shotgun. But he nodded respectfully and led his limping mount toward the small stable. Fiona hurried inside, suddenly aware of her wind-chapped face and worn dress. She smoothed her apron futilely, then chided herself for the gesture. What did it matter what some Eastern gentleman thought of her appearance? He'd be gone by morning, back to his grand ranch with its hired hands and cattle by the thousands. When Xavier Vance ducked through her doorway 20 minutes later, he filled the small cabin with his presence. He removed his hat, revealing thick dark hair, and smiled with genuine gratitude. "Your stable is better maintained than some I've seen in Helena," he said. "Thank you for the kindness, Miss Reed." "Fiona Reed." She gestured to the rough-hewn table where 2 bowls of stew waited. It's nothing fancy, but it's hot. He hung his coat on a peg and took a seat that made the sturdy chair look like a child's furniture. For a moment, Fiona felt a flutter of anxiety. She rarely had visitors, much less male ones, and never ones who looked like Xavier Vance. "This is your claim?" he asked, indicating the cabin with a sweep of his hand. "My parents. They died of fever 2 winters back. And you've been working it alone?" There was no condescension in his tone, only genuine curiosity. "I manage," she replied stiffly, expecting the usual lecture about how a woman couldn't possibly survive alone on the frontier. Instead, he tasted the stew and his eyes widened with appreciation. "This is excellent." A flush of unexpected pleasure warmed her cheeks. "I ain't pretty, sir, but I can cook," she said with a hint of defiance, the words escaping before she could stop them. Xavier Vance looked up from his bowl, studying her with those piercing blue eyes that seemed to see more than she wished to reveal. A long moment passed between them. "Miss Reed," he finally said, his voice low and earnest. "In my experience, pretty fades, but skill, that endures." He took another spoonful. "And I would argue that you are mistaken on both counts." The compliment, so unexpected and delivered with such sincerity, left Fiona momentarily speechless. She busied herself with her own meal, unsure how to respond. This man was a disruption to her carefully ordered existence, a reminder of all she had convinced herself she did not need or want. As the evening progressed, Xavier explained his journey west. The son of a Boston shipping magnate, he had broken with family tradition to pursue his own dream of building a cattle empire in the West. He spoke of his plans for the Rockingham with passion and intelligence that belied any notion that he was merely playing at being a rancher. "My father said I'd be back within 6 months, begging for my position in the company," he confided with a wry smile. "That was 3 years ago. I've been learning the cattle business from Texas to Wyoming, but this is the first spread that's truly mine." "The winters here will test you," Fiona warned, finding herself drawn into conversation despite her reservations. "Last year, the Johnson place lost half their herd to a February blizzard. That's why I'm here now, before the worst of it. I want to understand what I'm facing." His gaze was direct, uncompromising. "Would you consider advising me? You clearly know this land better than I do." The request, so plainly stated and respectful of her knowledge, caught Fiona off guard. Men, especially men of means, did not typically seek a woman's counsel on matters of land and livestock. "I could spare an hour or 2, she conceded, telling herself it was merely neighborly courtesy. "Though I doubt the owner of 3,000 acres has much to learn from someone scratching out a living on a homestead claim." "You underestimate yourself, Miss Reed." There was something in his voice that made her look up and meet his gaze. "You've survived alone where many men would have failed. That's worth learning from." That night, as Xavier slept on a pallet near the hearth, Fiona lay awake in her small bedroom, troubled by unfamiliar emotions. His presence had shattered the protective shell of isolation she had built around herself. For the first time in years, she found herself wondering if her conviction that the frontier allowed no room for connection might be wrong. When morning came, Xavier found his horse much improved, but still favoring its injured leg. "I should stay another day, if it wouldn't impose," he said. "I'd be glad to earn my keep. Your fence could use reinforcing before the next snow." Fiona wanted to refuse, to send him on his way and restore the solitude she had convinced herself was preferable. But practicality won out. Her fence did need repair, and her woodpile was lower than it should be this early in the season. "Very well," she agreed, more curtly than she intended. "But I work alongside anyone who works my land." He grinned, a flash of white teeth against his tanned face. "I wouldn't have it any other way." They spent the day laboring side by side. Fiona expected to find him soft and used to physical work, but Xavier matched her hour for hour, driving fence posts, chopping wood, and repairing a leak in the stable roof. As they worked, they talked about the challenges of the territory, about the neighboring spreads, about the coming winter. By the time darkness fell, Fiona realized with a start that she had spoken more words in one day than in the previous month. More surprisingly, she had enjoyed it. There was something about Xavier Vance that invited confidence. He listened as intently as he spoke, treating her observations with the same respect he might accord a seasoned rancher. Over supper, Their conversation turned personal. Xavier spoke of his estrangement from his father, of his determination to prove that a man should be measured by his own accomplishments rather than his inheritance. "What of you?" he asked, refilling her coffee cup. "Surely you had dreams beyond holding this homestead alone." Fiona hesitated. She had buried those dreams so deep she scarcely remembered them. "Once," she admitted, "I thought I might become a teacher. I have my mother's books. She taught me well. Why didn't you?" "After they died, there was the claim to prove up, the land to work." She shrugged. "Dreams are luxuries out here." "Or perhaps," he suggested gently, "they're necessities. What gives a person the strength to endure if not the hope of something better?" His words lingered in Fiona's mind long after they had retired for the night. She had convinced herself that survival alone was purpose enough, that wanting more was folly. Yet here was a man who had abandoned wealth and position to chase a dream across a continent. Was he foolish? Or was she the one whose vision had become too narrow? The next morning, Xavier's horse had recovered enough to travel. He saddled it with visible reluctance. "I'm in your debt, Miss Reed," he said, standing at her gate. "I'd like to repay your kindness properly. Would you consider dining at the Rockingham once I'm settled? I'd value your continued advice about managing through the winter." Fiona knew she should refuse. Getting entangled with a neighbor, especially one like Xavier Vance, could only complicate her carefully ordered existence. Yet she found herself nodding. "2 weeks from Sunday," she agreed. "Though I warn you, I don't own anything grand enough for formal dining." "Wear whatever you please," he replied with that direct gaze that seemed to see through her defenses. "It's your company I'm interested in, not your attire." As she watched him ride away, Fiona felt something shift inside her, a crack in the fortress she had built around her heart. She told herself it was merely the prospect of a proper meal in a proper house, nothing more. But even as the thought formed, she knew it for the lie it was. 2 weeks passed, during which Fiona found herself glancing north toward the Rockingham more often than she cared to admit. Rumors reached her through the occasional passing traveler. The new owner was making extensive improvements, hiring local men, paying fair wages. He'd brought in a cook from Helena and ordered supplies enough for a small army. When Sunday arrived, Fiona spent an unprecedented hour preparing herself. She unearthed her mother's good dress from its trunk, a simple but well-made blue wool that had seen little wear. She washed her hair and arranged it with care, securing it with her mother's tortoiseshell combs. The looking-glass showed a young woman she scarcely recognized, not beautiful, perhaps, but fresher, somehow. More alive. The ride to the Rockingham took less than an hour. As she crested the final rise, Fiona gasped despite herself. The old Miller place had been transformed. New fencing surrounded the main house, which had been repainted a crisp white. The barn had been expanded, and several new outbuildings stood in neat rows. Men moved purposefully about the yard, leading horses and carrying supplies. As she approached, Xavier emerged from the main house. He wore no coat despite the chill, just a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up and dark trousers. He looked completely in his element, a man building his kingdom. "Miss Reed," he called, striding to meet her. "You came." The pleasure in his voice was unmistakable. "I said I would," she replied, allowing him to help her down from her horse. His hands at her waist were strong and sure, lingering just a moment longer than necessary. "You look lovely," he said quietly, and the simple sincerity in his tone made her cheeks warm. "The dress was my mother's," she admitted. "I haven't had occasion to wear it before." "Then I'm honored to be the occasion." He offered his arm. "Come, let me show you what I've been doing." The tour of the ranch revealed the scope of Xavier's ambition. He had already purchased 500 head of cattle, with plans to triple that by spring. The bunkhouse accommodated 12 men, though only 8 were currently employed. The main house had been completely refurbished, with new furniture from Helena and a kitchen that would have been the envy of any Eastern mansion. "This is all very grand," Fiona observed as they completed the tour. "But how will you manage when winter truly sets in? Your men are capable, but none of them look like they've faced a Montana blizzard." Xavier led her into the dining room, where a table had been set for 2. "That's precisely why I wanted your counsel. You know this land as they do not." He held her chair. "I've hired local men when possible, but experience is hard to come by." Over a dinner more elaborate than any Fiona had eaten since leaving her childhood home back east, they discussed the practical challenges of ranching in the territory. She found herself speaking freely, offering advice about winter preparations, the peculiarities of local weather patterns, and the challenges of keeping stock watered when temperatures plummeted. "You should consider digging a second well closer to the north pasture," she suggested. "When the snow is deep, moving cattle to water becomes nearly impossible." "Consider it done," Xavier replied. "What else?" By the time dessert arrived, an apple pie that even Fiona had to admit rivaled her own, they had drafted plans for additional windbreaks, emergency feed storage, and improved shelter for the most vulnerable stock. "You know," Xavier said, leaning back in his chair, "I could use someone with your knowledge on a permanent basis. I'd be willing to pay well for a consulting arrangement." Fiona's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Are you offering me employment, Mr. Vance?" "I'm offering you a partnership, of sorts." His blue eyes were intent on hers. "Your knowledge and my resources. Together, we could build something remarkable." "People would talk," she said carefully. "A single woman working closely with a single man. Let them talk." He reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of hers. "Unless there's another reason you would refuse." The question hung between them, laden with unspoken possibility. Fiona felt herself standing at a crossroads. Behind her lay the safety of isolation, the certainty of independence. Ahead, something unknown and frightening in its potential. "I need time to consider," she said finally. "Of course." He withdrew his hand. "The offer stands, whenever you decide." The ride home that evening was both shorter and longer than the journey out, shorter in time, longer in thought. Fiona found herself replaying every moment of the day, analyzing each word, each glance. What did Xavier Vance truly want from her? Knowledge and experience, certainly. But there had been something else in his eyes, something that stirred emotions she had long believed dormant. Winter descended on the territory with brutal efficiency the following week. The first major storm dumped 3 feet of snow overnight, with drifts twice that height against buildings and fences. Fiona spent 2 days digging paths to her barn and well, checking on her small herd of cattle, and reinforcing her shelter against the wind that howled like a living thing. On the 3rd day, as she struggled to clear her roof of snow before its weight caused damage, a party of riders appeared through the swirling white. Xavier led them, his tall figure unmistakable even bundled against the cold. "Miss Reed," he called, dismounting with fluid grace despite the conditions. "We've been checking on outlying homesteads. Are you managing?" "Well enough," she answered, climbing carefully down her ladder. "Though I'm grateful for the concern." Xavier gestured to his men. "Check the barn and fences. Make any repairs needed." To Fiona, he said more quietly, "I would have come sooner, but the north pasture required attention." "You needn't have come at all," she replied, though in truth, the sight of him sent an unexpected warmth through her chilled body. "I've weathered worse alone." "No doubt." His smile was gentle. "But perhaps you no longer need to." The simple statement, delivered without pressure or expectation, pierced Fiona's carefully maintained defenses. For 2 years, she had prided herself on needing no one, on proving that a woman alone could survive the frontier. Yet here was a man offering not rescue but partnership, acknowledging her strength while suggesting that solitude was a choice, not a necessity. Xavier's men worked efficiently, repairing a section of fence that had collapsed under the snow's weight and reinforcing the barn's roof. By late afternoon, when they prepared to depart, Fiona's homestead was more secure than it had been in months. "Thank you," she said to Xavier as he prepared to mount. This was unexpected. "Neighbors help neighbors," he replied simply. Then, more hesitantly, "I miss our conversations, Miss Reed. The house seems quiet without your insights." The admission, so honestly offered, touched something in Fiona. "Perhaps when the weather clears, I could ride over to discuss your spring planning." His smile warmed his entire face. "I would like that very much." As December gave way to January, a pattern emerged. Every week or so, regardless of weather, Xavier would appear at her homestead, sometimes with men, sometimes alone. Each visit had a practical purpose, delivering supplies, helping with repairs, sharing news from town. But beneath the practicality ran a current of something deeper. They talked about books. He had an extensive library, about the territory's future, about their respective pasts. Fiona found herself revealing things she had told no one. Her fear when her parents fell ill, her determination to honor their sacrifice by keeping the land, her loneliness during those first awful months alone. In turn, Xavier spoke of his complicated relationship with his family, his desire to build something entirely his own, his occasional doubts about the wisdom of his venture so far from civilization. "Sometimes I wake in the night," he confessed during a January evening as they sat before her fire, "and wonder if my father was right, if I'm merely playing at being a rancher, destined to fail when true hardship strikes." "You've already faced true hardship," Fiona countered. "That blizzard last week collapsed 2 barns at the Johnson place. Yours stood firm because of the reinforcements you designed." "With your advice," he reminded her. "My advice wouldn't matter if you hadn't been willing to listen." She met his gaze steadily. "Most men wouldn't, especially to a woman. Most men are fools then." His voice dropped lower. "You are the most capable person I have ever met, Fiona Reed." Man or woman? The use of her first name, so intimate in the firelight's glow, sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the winter cold. They sat in companionable silence for several minutes, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the small cabin. "I should go," Xavier said finally, though he made no move to rise. "The hour grows late." "You could stay," Fiona offered, her heart suddenly pounding. "The storm is worsening. It would be foolish to ride in such conditions." His eyes, so blue and direct, searched hers. "If I stay tonight, Fiona, people will certainly talk." "Let them talk," she echoed his words from months before, surprising herself with her boldness. "Unless there's another reason you would refuse." A slow smile spread across his face, not the polite expression he wore in company, but something more private, more genuine. "No," he said softly. "There is no other reason." He slept on the pallet by the fire, as he had that first night. But something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing steadily since their first meeting. Neither spoke of it directly, but it hung in the air between them, rich with possibility. In February, disaster struck. A devastating fire broke out in the Rocking M's main barn during a particularly vicious cold snap. By the time it was contained, the structure was a total loss, along with 30 head of cattle and a season's worth of hay. Fiona learned of it from a passing freighter and rode immediately to offer assistance. The scene that greeted her was one of controlled chaos. Men working to salvage what they could, others constructing temporary shelter for the remaining stock. Xavier moved among them, giving directions, his face streaked with soot, his usual composure strained but intact. When he spotted her, something like relief flashed across his features. "Fiona," he said, coming to meet her. "You shouldn't have risked the ride in this cold." "Don't be ridiculous," she replied, dismounting. "What can I do?" For the next 3 days, Fiona worked alongside Xavier and his men, helping to reorganize their winter survival plan. Her knowledge of maximizing limited resources proved invaluable as they redistributed stock, calculated feed requirements, and constructed emergency shelters. On the evening of the 3rd day, she found Xavier alone in what remained of his study, poring over account books by lamplight. The strain of the past days showed in the tight set of his shoulders and the shadows beneath his eyes. "The losses are significant," he said without looking up as she entered, "but not catastrophic. We'll survive until spring." Fiona placed a cup of coffee beside him. "Of course you will." He looked up then, and the naked vulnerability in his expression caught at her heart. "I nearly lost everything," he said quietly. "Another hour, and the fire might have reached the house. The entire herd could have been lost." "But it wasn't," she reminded him. "You acted quickly. Your men respect you enough to follow your lead without question. That's no small thing." Xavier pushed the account books aside and took the coffee, his fingers brushing hers in a touch that seemed both accidental and deliberate. "When I saw you riding in that day," he said slowly, "I felt steadier, as though no disaster could be insurmountable with you beside me." The simple declaration hung in the air between them. Fiona felt her carefully constructed defenses crumbling in the face of his honesty. "I've been thinking about your offer," she said, her voice unsteady despite her efforts to control it. "The partnership." And his gaze was intent, hopeful. "I believe I would accept, under the right conditions." "Name them." "I keep my homestead. It remains in my name, regardless of our arrangement." This was non-negotiable. Her parents had died for that land. She would not surrender it, not even for Xavier. Agreed, he said without hesitation. What else? I want a formal contract, legally binding. My contribution valued in writing. A smile tugged at his mouth. You drive a hard bargain, Miss Reed. I've had to, she replied simply. Consider it done. He set down his cup. Anything else? Fiona took a deep breath. This was the moment to speak plainly or forever hold her peace. Yes, I need to understand exactly what kind of partnership you're proposing, Xavier. Business? Neighborly? Or something else entirely? For a long moment, he was silent, studying her face as though memorizing its contours. Then he rose and moved around the desk to stand before her. When I first came west, he said quietly, I believed I was seeking independence. The freedom to build something that was entirely my own. I thought success would be measured in acres and head of cattle. He took her hands in his, and Fiona was struck by how natural it felt. I was wrong. True success is finding someone who sees you clearly and values what they see. Someone whose strength complements your own. He drew her gently closer. I'm proposing a partnership in every sense of the word, Fiona Reed. Business, certainly. Neighborly, of course. But mostly, I'm asking if you would consider building a life with me. The words, so plainly spoken, reached into the deepest part of Fiona, the part that had ached with loneliness even as she denied its existence. For 2 years, she had convinced herself that the frontier allowed no room for connection, that survival demanded isolation. Xavier Vance had systematically dismantled that belief, showing her that true strength could be found in partnership rather than solitude. I'm not what most men want in a wife, she said, needing him to understand exactly whom he was choosing. I'm stubborn and plain-spoken. I'll never be content to simply keep house or host parties. Thank God for that, he replied with feeling. I've known plenty of society wives, Fiona. What I want, what I need, is a partner who will stand beside me through whatever comes, who will speak her mind and expect me to listen, who will help me build something that matters. His hands tightened on hers. I love you for exactly who you are, not despite it. The declaration, so heartfelt, so certain, broke the final barrier around Fiona's heart. Yes, she said simply. Yes to all of it. The business partnership, the life together. She smiled up at him, feeling lighter than she had in years. I love you too, Xavier Vance. Rather against my better judgment. His laugh was warm as he drew her into his arms. The best decisions often are. Their wedding took place in April, as the last of the snow melted and the first green began to appear across the prairie. It was a small affair by Eastern standards, but grand for the territory. The entire community turned out, curious about the union between the impressive newcomer and the stubborn homesteader girl who had defied expectations. They were married on Fiona's homestead, beneath the cottonwood where her parents were buried. Xavier had insisted on this location, understanding without being told that she needed their blessing, however symbolic. They would be proud, he whispered as they exchanged vows. As am I, to be joining my life with yours. By summer, the changes were evident across both properties. The Rocking Inn had expanded its operation, with Fiona's practical knowledge of the territory guiding Xavier's ambitious vision. Her homestead remained her own, as promised, but now served as a breeding operation for the ranch's expanding herd. Most significant were the changes in Fiona herself. The isolation that had defined her existence for so long had given way to partnership that enhanced rather than diminished her independence. She found that loving Xavier made her stronger, not weaker, more confident in her judgments, more willing to take necessary risks. For his part, Xavier flourished with Fiona beside him. His natural leadership combined with her practical experience created a ranch operation that quickly became the standard against which others were measured. Their reputation for fair dealing and innovative practices spread throughout the territory. One evening in late summer, they sat together on the porch of the newly expanded main house. The day's work was done, the ranch quiet except for the distant lowing of cattle and the chirp of crickets beginning their nightly chorus. I received a letter from my father today, Xavier said, his arm comfortably around Fiona's shoulders. He's finally acknowledged our marriage. I'm surprised he even knows of it, Fiona replied, leaning into his embrace. In the months since their wedding, Xavier's family had maintained a pointed silence regarding their union. Apparently, News of our success has reached even Boston. There was a note of satisfaction in his voice. He suggests he might visit next summer to see this empire I'm building. And will you welcome him? Fiona asked carefully, knowing how deeply the estrangement had wounded her husband. Xavier was quiet for a moment, contemplating. Yes, he said finally. I'd like him to see what we've created together, to understand that I found something far more valuable than I ever would have in the family business. He turned to look at her, his expression softening in the golden light of sunset. Do you know what I think about sometimes, Fiona? That night we met. If my horse hadn't gone lame, if you hadn't been the sort of woman who would take in a stranger despite your misgivings, if 100 other things had gone differently, I might never have found you. The thought terrifies me. Fiona reached up to touch his face, still marveling that this remarkable man had chosen her. Yet here we are. Here we are, he agreed, covering her hand with his own, building something that will outlast us both. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the vast Montana sky in shades of gold and crimson, Fiona reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had once believed that the frontier allowed no room for dreams beyond mere survival, that love was a luxury she could not afford. Xavier Vance had shown her otherwise, that even in the harshest of landscapes, the human heart could find not just shelter but abundance. That strength lay not in isolation but in the courage to build connections despite the risks. I was wrong, you know, she said softly. That first night when I told you I wasn't pretty but I could cook. Xavier's laugh rumbled beneath her ear. You were wrong on both counts. You are beautiful in ways that matter, Fiona Vance. And your cooking, while excellent, is the least of your talents. She smiled, watching the first stars appear in the deepening blue of the eastern sky. The territory would always be challenging. There would be harsh winters, failed crops, losses both expected and unforeseen. But facing them together, they had built something neither could have created alone. Not just a successful ranch, but a home where both their dreams could flourish. In the end, that was the true bounty of the frontier, not land or cattle or material success, but the freedom to discover that even in the wildest places, the human heart could find its perfect home.